During this Adobe Photoshop tutorial, you will learn about the blur feature. Once again, make sure you have the Photoshop overview picture open and that you have the history panel open as well. If you don't see the history panel, simply come to Window and select History from the drop-down menu. Notice the picture is pretty clear. We are going to actually apply a filter to blur the picture. There are some times where you might actually want to blur your images for different purposes depending on your design. You'll notice under Filter there's an option for Blur, which then has a pop-up menu of a lot of additional options. You can blur, blur more, Gaussian blur, etc. The one that's used the most when blurring a photo for the sake of giving it a brushed look, you would use the Gaussian blur. Pulls up a little window where you can bring up your image and then apply the amount of blur that you might want to apply to it. And this gives you a preview here so you know how much blur is actually occurring. Let me dramatically affect this picture so you can see that's what a blur of as much as I went on this bar down here. If I pushed it all the way over and increased the blur, you can see that it got really bad. Let's go ahead and take it down to a reasonable amount. But when you see some pictures, for example, that look polished, they look airbrushed, so to speak, you can guarantee that they have applied a blur to some degree. Very small, very, very, very small radius, but it is definitely there. And that helps you get that polished look to an image. So when you're touching up photos, this is definitely a feature you're going to want to actually use. We're going to go ahead and click on OK. We're going to come back out. We're going to go back into our filters, back into blur. I'm going to show you a different one. We're going to use a lens blur. And this is going to actually give us some different options. And you can see that it's kind of already applied some of the features. But in the lens blur, it's almost like it's taking me back to if I was using the camera to create this blur. So I can affect the actual radius of where the blur is going to happen. So I can either increase or decrease that. There's curvature, there's rotation on the blur so that you can actually affect those pieces as well as the brightness, and then how much noise. Noise means you're adding more, and it looks like you can see here on my screen where you've added texture to it, and you can see that it's done that here. And so now on top of that, if I blur it, it's going to begin to have like a very interesting look to it. Typically you would use these when you're actually designing specifically to have a certain effect. For example, I'm sure you've seen there are some windows that have a certain density to them that cause this kind of effect. When you're trying to look through that kind of a window, it would have this kind of look to it. So there are times where you might actually want to use this effect, or perhaps to make something look old. This would definitely give you the effects you would need to make a fairly new picture look a lot older. Of course, you would want it a little more visible than that, but you can overlay another image on top to still have that old look with a clearer picture. So that's what you would use to actually create those kinds of effects. So again, you go to Filter and you go to Blur, and you can find lots of different blur options here, which you can certainly have some fun with and create different kinds of effects.